In 1798, as Napoleon Bonaparte sailed toward Egypt with an army of 40,000 men, he brought something unusual for a general obsessed with logistics. A stack of books about a 14th-century Central Asian warlord most of his officers had never heard of. Napoleon wasn't just reading about Tamerlane. He was studying him, copying his methods, measuring himself against him. The greatest military mind Europe had produced in 1,000 years looked east to a limping nomad from Uzbekistan and saw someone he wanted to become. This is the story of why. Here's what almost nobody in the West realizes. The great captains that European military academies taught for centuries, the men every ambitious officer was told to study, weren't only European. Napoleon himself named his personal shortlist: Alexander, Hannibal, Caesar, Gustavus Adolphus, Frederick the Great, and Genghis Khan and Tamerlane. Two Central Asian conquerors sitting on the same list as Caesar in the mind of the man who redrew the map of Europe. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what Napoleon saw in a 14th-century nomad and why the connection runs a lot deeper than a reading list. Let's set the stage. In 1336, in a small town near Samarkand, in what's now Uzbekistan, a boy named Timur was born into a minor noble family of the Barlas tribe, Turkified descendants of Genghis Khan's Mongol armies. He wasn't born a prince. He clawed his way up through decades of civil war in Central Asia, surviving an arrow to the leg that crippled him for life, hence his Persian nickname, Timur-e-Lang, Timur the Lame. Europeans later mangled that into Tamerlane. By 1370, at age 34, he controlled Samarkand and the surrounding region. Over the next 35 years, he built an empire stretching from Delhi to Moscow, crushed the Golden Horde, sacked Baghdad and Damascus, and most relevant to our story, annihilated one of the most feared armies in the world at the Battle of Ankara in 1402, capturing the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I alive. He never lost a major battle in over 35 years of continuous campaigning. Read that again. Not rarely lost. Never lost. Not to the Golden Horde. Not to Persia. Not to the Delhi Sultanate and its war elephants. Not to the Ottomans, arguably the strongest military power in the Islamic world at the time. That statistic alone is why military strategists 4 centuries later still couldn't stop talking about him. So what exactly made Timur's generalship so studyable? First, deception as doctrine. Timur rarely fought the battle his enemy expected. Before Ankara, he vanished his entire army from Ottoman scouts, doubled back, and appeared behind Sultan Bayezid's exhausted forces, forcing a battle on Timur's terms after a brutal forced march had already worn the Ottomans down. Napoleon would build his entire Italian campaign on the same principle: move faster than your enemy expects and make him fight where you choose, not where he planned. Second, intelligence as a weapon. Timur maintained a spy network across the entire Islamic world. Merchants, dervishes, diplomats, servants, feeding him information before his enemies had finished making their plans. Napoleon's obsession with reconnaissance, mapping, and rapid intelligence gathering echoes this almost exactly. Third, psychological warfare at scale. After the Persian city of Isfahan revolted against him in 1387, Timur ordered his soldiers to build towers out of the skulls of the dead, reportedly around 28 towers. It was calculated terror. Cities began surrendering without a fight, purely on reputation. Napoleon never went that far, but the underlying principle that an army's reputation can defeat an enemy before a shot is fired is straight out of Timur's playbook. Fourth, speed and mobility. Timur's armies, built on the mobile cavalry tradition of the steppe, could cover ground that stunned, settled empires used to slower, heavier forces. Here's where it gets specific. Napoleon didn't absorb Timur's tactics by osmosis. There's a documented paper trail. In the 18th century, a French Orientalist named François Pétis de la Croix had written a hugely popular biography of Tamerlane, drawing on Persian and Arab sources. It circulated widely among educated Europeans obsessed with Oriental history. Napoleon, a voracious and famously systematic reader even as a young artillery officer on Corsica, is recorded compiling reading notes on great commanders, a habit he kept for most of his life. Timur appears on those lists, grouped with Alexander, Hannibal, and Genghis Khan, as commanders whose campaigns Napoleon believed contained transferable lessons in strategy. And it wasn't just idle reading. When Napoleon planned his 1798 Egyptian campaign, he was stepping into the same broad geography that Alexander and Timur had once fought across. Napoleon explicitly framed himself in that lineage. He wanted to be seen, by his own soldiers, by history, as the next name on that list. There's a telling detail here. Napoleon reportedly told his officers in Egypt that he saw himself continuing a tradition of Oriental conquerors who understood that speed, terror, and psychological dominance could substitute for numbers. The reference point he reached for was Tamerlane, not Louis XIV. This is worth pausing on, because it's the real hook of this video. Why would a European general in 1800, obsessed with revolutionary ideals and modern artillery, look to a 14th century Central Asian nomad instead of a more familiar Western predecessor? The answer is almost mathematical. Alexander conquered a lot and died young, an inspiring but incomplete case study. Caesar was a brilliant tactician but operated within a relatively contained Mediterranean theater. Hannibal, for all his genius, ultimately lost his war. Timur, by contrast, offered something rare. Undefeated, for decades, across wildly different terrains, deserts, mountains, river crossings, jungle-adjacent India, against wildly different types of enemies, from heavy Ottoman infantry to Indian war elephants to Golden Horde cavalry. For a student of war looking for a repeatable system rather than a single inspiring campaign, Timur was the more complete dataset. That is exactly the kind of case study a systematic mind like Napoleon's, a man who reorganized artillery doctrine, reformed the entire French legal code, and treated warfare as an engineering problem, would gravitate toward. Here's where the story turns, because history loves irony, and this is a good one. Timur's empire, for all its military brilliance, collapsed almost immediately after his death in 1405. He built a war machine, not a lasting state. Within a generation, his sons and grandsons were fighting each other over the pieces. Napoleon's empire suffered almost exactly the same fate. Built at extraordinary speed through the same core principles, mobility, deception, psychological dominance, rapid, decisive battles, it began unraveling within a decade of its peak and collapsed entirely within 5 years of his Russian campaign failing. Both men mastered the creation of an empire through war. Neither mastered its survival after the wars stopped. Timur's most enduring legacy wasn't his military machine at all. It was Samarkand, the city he filled with the finest architects and scholars looted from 100 conquered cities. Napoleon left something more lasting too. Not the empire, but the Napoleonic Code, the legal framework that still shapes law across parts of Europe today. Two conquerors, 6 centuries apart, both discovering the same lesson the hard way. Armies win territory, but they don't hold it. Institutions do. One more thread worth pulling before we close, because it shows how far Timur's shadow actually reached. Timur's dynasty didn't just vanish with him. His great-great-grandson, a prince named Babur, driven out of Central Asia by rival Uzbek tribes, headed south into India instead, and founded the Mughal Empire, one of the richest and most powerful empires in world history. The Taj Mahal exists several generations later because of a Timurid descendant. So when Napoleon studied Tamerlane, he was studying the founder of a military tradition whose bloodline was, by pure historical coincidence, still ruling one of the largest empires on earth at that very moment, the Mughal Empire, only formally ending in 1857, decades after Napoleon's own death. The nomad from a small town near Samarkand didn't just inspire a French emperor's reading list. His descendants were still on a throne while Napoleon was drawing up his own conquest of Egypt a few thousand kilometers away. So, the next time you picture Napoleon hunched over a map in Egypt, remember what And who was actually shaping his thinking? Not just Caesar, not just Alexander. A limping nomad from Central Asia who never lost a battle in 35 years and whose playbook of speed, terror, and information warfare quietly outlived him by 4 centuries. History likes to tell itself as a Western story with a few exotic footnotes. The truth is messier and a lot more interesting. Some of Europe's most celebrated minds were, quite literally, doing their homework on the East. If you want more stories like this, where Central Asia's forgotten empires reach further into world history than anyone tells you, subscribe. There's a lot more of this story left to tell.